A struggling single dad lets his daughter choose just one book from a tiny town bookstore, never expecting the woman behind the counter to be a reclusive millionaire haunted by the father she lost. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The bell above the door let out a tired jingle as Jack Nolan pushed it open, holding the door for his daughter as she skipped into the small, shadowy bookstore. Dust danced in the beams of light cutting through the tall windows, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and something sweet, maybe vanilla, maybe time itself. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you whisper even when no one's told you to. Sadie took it all in with wide, curious eyes, her red knit hat a little crooked, and her backpack bouncing with each step. Jack glanced around, shoulders tightening at the rows of leaning bookshelves and crooked stacks on the floor. This wasn't the kind of store that expected customers. It was the kind that had made peace with being forgotten. "Just one," he reminded her softly. "Whichever one you want, but only one." Sadie nodded solemnly, as if he'd given her the most serious mission in the world. She wandered off between two shelves, the soles of her boots scuffing softly against the wooden floor. Jack looked toward the counter, half expecting a clerk to appear. No one did. Behind the counter, a small lamp glowed beside a steaming mug and a cracked-open journal. He cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle anyone. A few moments passed before she appeared. From behind a narrow door tucked between the shelves, a woman stepped out tall. With dark auburn hair pulled into a loose bun, a sweater draped over her shoulders like armor. She didn't speak right away. Just looked at him, her eyes a shade too sharp for someone who hadn't said hello. "I'll be quick," Jack offered, "just letting my daughter pick a book." The woman gave a single nod, her gaze sliding past him to where Sadie was crouched, flipping carefully through a fairy tale collection with a worn spine and gold-lettered title. A flicker of something crossed the woman's face. Recognition, or maybe grief. "She's got good taste," she said quietly. Jack offered a faint smile. "Gets it from her mom." The woman didn't respond. She just leaned against the counter, watching Sadie with a kind of distant ache as if she were remembering something she didn't quite want to feel again. The sound of Sadie's laughter echoed softly between the rows of old books, light and free in a space that hadn't known that kind of joy in years. She was sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor, her pink mittens tucked in her coat pocket, flipping through a book so worn it looked like it had lived a dozen lives before landing in her hands. Her fingers gently traced the illustrations of castles and wild forests, of princesses and wolves and promises made under moonlight. Clara Bellamy stood just inside the back room, half hidden by the doorframe. She hadn't meant to linger. She rarely watched customers, rarely had any to watch. But there was something about the girl's voice that stopped her. Something familiar. Not in sound, but in feeling. The father, Jack, she thought he'd said, stood quietly nearby, leaning against the edge of the counter. He hadn't noticed her yet. Clara could have stepped back into the quiet safety of her office, closed the door, buried herself in inventory sheets and tea she'd never finish. But instead she stayed. "She really likes that one," he said, noticing her presence at last. Clara stepped out fully now, smoothing the sleeves of her sweater. "That book's older than she is," she replied, her voice calm, measured. "Maybe even older than me." Jack smiled politely. "You don't look a day over 29. She didn't smile back, but something in her eyes softened. "That book was the first I ever read, cover to cover," she said, gaze drifting toward the girl again. "My father used to read it to me before bed, every night. Same story, same pages." Her voice wavered on the last word, like a door creaked open somewhere in her chest. Sadie looked up then, holding the book as if it were something sacred. "This is the one," she said, beaming. "It's perfect." Clara blinked, startled out of the memory. She nodded once, tightly. "Good choice." Jack stepped forward to pay, but Clara waved it off. "Take it. It's on the house." He hesitated. "Are you sure?" Clara nodded. Some stories are meant to be passed on. And as they turned to leave, she found herself still watching the girl with the crooked hat. heart aching in a place she'd long convinced herself was numb. Sadie held the book to her chest like it was a treasure, her small fingers wrapped protectively around the frayed spine. Jack stood beside her, wallet in hand, still unsure about the woman behind the counter. Clara hadn't moved much, just stood there with one hand resting on the edge of a thick ledger, the other holding on to silence, like it was safer than small talk. "Are you sure?" Jack asked again, gesturing to the book. "I don't mind paying, really." Clara glanced at him, expression unreadable. "I said it's fine." Her tone wasn't harsh, exactly, just closed. Distant, like someone answering from behind a glass wall. He gave her a small, appreciative nod. "Well, thank you. It means a lot." She didn't reply, not to him, but her gaze flicked to Sadie again, whose eyes sparkled as she flipped through the first few pages on their way to the door. "I've never seen one like this before," Sadie said, not looking up. "It's got pictures and poems and little stories, all mixed together. It's kind of like a dream book." Clara's lips curved, not a smile exactly, but close. It was meant to feel that way. Sadie looked up then, head tilted. "Did you make it?" Clara blinked. "No," she said quietly. "But my father used to read it to me, every night." Sadie nodded like that made perfect sense. "My mom used to sing me songs before bed," she said. "But she's gone now." Jack glanced down, startled. Clara's expression didn't change much, but something in her posture shifted. Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the counter, as if bracing herself. "I'm sorry," she said. Two simple words, spoken softly like she meant them more than she was ready to admit. Sadie smiled, small and sincere. "It's okay. My dad tells really good stories. And now I can read them to him." For the first time, Clara let out the quietest breath of a laugh. At the door, Sadie turned back, hugging the book to her chest again. "Thank you," she said, her voice just above a whisper. And Clara, standing alone in her shadowed little shop, whispered back, "You're welcome." The door closed behind them with a soft jingle, followed by the faint crunch of boots on wet pavement. Outside, the rain had returned light and misty, casting a silver sheen over the narrow street. Clara stood still behind the counter, her hands resting lightly on the wood, as if anchoring herself to something real. She watched through the fogged window as Jack pulled the hood of his coat up over his head, then leaned down to adjust Sadie's scarf before taking her hand. The little girl was still clutching the book to her chest like it was some kind of rare gem. She looked back once, as if expecting Clara to be watching. She was. Clara didn't wave, didn't smile. But her eyes lingered long after the girl turned away, and they disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the steady rhythm of rain and the quiet hush of a small-town afternoon. She hadn't planned to give that book away. In fact, she hadn't touched it in years not, since the day the shop had gone from being her father's sanctuary to her own exile. It had sat on that shelf, untouched, unmentioned, like a sleeping ghost, and then a little girl with pink mittens and a crooked hat had pulled it from its slumber with sticky fingers and bright eyes, like it had been waiting just for her. Clara stepped out from behind the counter and walked slowly to the front window. The street was quiet now, the kind of stillness that made you feel every breath. She reached up and traced a small circle in the condensation on the glass, her fingertip leaving behind a smudge of warmth. She hadn't felt this unsettled in a long time, not scared. Not sad, curious. That was the word. Curious about the man who didn't push, about the girl who looked like she believed in magic, about why something as simple as letting go of a book had left her with a knot in her chest and a hollowness in her throat. And somewhere beneath all of it so faint she almost missed, it was something else. Regret. By the time Jack and Sadie pulled into the gravel driveway, the rain had turned to a fine mist that clung to the windshield like breath on glass. The old sedan wheezed to a stop in front of the house, a squat, paint-chipped rental tucked between two overgrown hedges that hadn't seen clippers in years. The porch light flickered once, then gave up entirely. Inside, the heater groaned awake with a reluctant shudder, coughing out lukewarm air that barely cut through the chill. Jack kicked off his boots by the door, avoiding the loose floorboard that always creaked like a scream. Sadie danced past him, still holding her book like it was made of gold. "Can I read it now?" she asked, already halfway to the couch. Jack smiled tiredly. "Only if you change out of those wet socks first." She paused mid-step, then sighed. "Fine," she said with exaggerated drama, but her grin gave her away. As she disappeared into her room, Jack moved to the kitchen and set the kettle on the stove. A pile of unopened mail waited on the counter, all the envelopes the same dull shades of white and beige that spelled overdue. He rubbed a hand down his face and set them aside for later, the kind of later he'd been pushing forward for too long. The radiator hissed again, a protesting puff that reminded him just how fragile everything was inside these four walls. He made a mental note to call about it next week, or maybe the week after that. If the shop gave him a few more hours. From the other room, he heard Sadie's voices, soft, rhythmic, reading out loud. He leaned against the doorway, watching her curled on the couch with the fairy tale book open in her lap. Her wet socks were in a messy heap on the floor, her hair damp and frizzy from the rain. She was beaming. She had wings made of stars, Sadie read, but she didn't know how to fly until someone reminded her what the sky felt like. Jack exhaled slowly. Something in his chest, easing just a bit. For tonight, the bills could wait. The heater could rattle. The world could spin outside without him. Because in that moment, as his daughter disappeared into a story that had already outlived 2 childhoods, the house felt miraculously like home. The next morning, Sadie woke up before the sun, tangled in blankets, her cheeks flushed with sleep, and something more, something dream-deep and story-born. Jack found her sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, the fairy tale book open in front of her, eyes wide and far away. "You're up early," he said, rubbing his neck as he shuffled into the room, coffee half poured in one hand. Sadie didn't answer right away. Her gaze was locked on a particular page, fingers resting gently on an illustration of a girl with silver wings, standing at the edge of a shadowy forest. "I saw her," Sadie whispered finally. "Last night, in my dream." Jack set the coffee down. "Who?" "The girl in the story," she said. "She was trying to find the moon, but she got lost. There were trees and wind and a wolf that wasn't really a wolf." Jack crouched beside her. "You dreamed all that?" Sadie nodded slowly. "It felt real, like I was there with her, like she knew I was watching." Jack didn't quite know what to say. He glanced at the book, at the fading ink and soft curling corners of pages read 100 times before. It was just a story. But something in Sadie's voice made it feel like maybe it wasn't just anything. Miles across town, in a bookshop, still steeped in morning quiet, Clara stared at the same page, the same girl. She hadn't meant to open the book again, hadn't touched it in years. But last night, after the rain, she couldn't stop thinking about the child who'd walked away with Ite, and the way her tiny voice had echoed with something impossibly old. Clara traced the edge of the page with a fingertip, remembering how her father used to pause on this exact line. The stars above her were not light, but memory. He always said that part was his favorite. She'd never asked why. Now, the words pressed down on her differently, like they were trying to say something she wasn't quite ready to hear. It was just a book, except it wasn't. Not for Sadie, and not for Clara either. The bell above the door gave its usual tired jingle as Jack stepped inside, the morning light spilling in behind him. The shop looked exactly the same as before him, quiet, and somehow older than the day itself. Dust hung in the air like secrets, caught in the shafts of sunlight filtering through the high front windows. Clara glanced up from the counter, already bracing herself for some kind of pitch or return. But when she saw who it was, something in her expression wavered, not surprised exactly, not annoyed either, just uncertain. Jack lifted a hand in a small wave. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." Clara closed the ledger she'd been working on. "You're back." He held up a small plastic bag in one hand, a screwdriver tucked under his arm. "I noticed yesterday your front door hinge was sticking. Thought I'd come by and fix it, no charge. Figured it was the least I could do, considering you gave my daughter a treasure." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "You're not the kind of man who takes no for an answer, are you?" Jack smiled, not smug, just easy. "Only when I know it's not a real one." For a second, Clara didn't speak. The polite thing would have been to refuse. To say it wasn't necessary, that she had it handled, that she didn't owe him anything. But the truth was, the door had been sticking for months, and the truth was, she hadn't had a real conversation with someone who wasn't delivering boxes or asking for store hours in a very long time. She hesitated, then nodded once, briskly. "Back room's through there. Tools are in the cabinet by the sink." Jack headed that way without another word, the bag in his hand rustling softly. Clara watched him go, arms folded, unsure what bothered her more, that he'd come back at all, or that a part of her was glad he had. Clara had retreated to the counter, pretending to busy herself with old receipts and restocking lists she'd already triple-checked. She kept her head down, but her ears were attuned to every creak of the floorboards in the back. Jack was quiet. Methodical tools clinking softly, a hinge squealing once, then going silent. Efficient. Capable. Too comfortable in a place she'd long considered untouchable. The bell jingled again. This time, Clara looked up to see Sadie bounding in, hair in pigtails, the same fairy tale book tucked under her arm like it never left her side. She scanned the shop quickly, spotted Clara, and beamed. "Hi again." Clara nodded slowly. "Hello. My dad said he was fixing something, so I asked if I could come too. I wanted to show the book where it used to live." Before Clara could reply, Sadie was already moving down the aisle, whispering to the shelves, letting her fingers skim over the book spines like she was greeting old friends. Then she began humming a soft, off-key tune that drifted through the shop like warm air on a cold day, and then she laughed. Not loudly, just a light, unguarded giggle as she pulled a particularly lopsided book from a high shelf and nearly dropped it. The sound startled Clara more than she cared to admit. It had been so long since laughter had lived in this shop that it felt foreign, almost out of place, like a bird flying into a room that had been locked for years. Clara stood frozen for a moment, unsure what to do with the way her chest tightened and loosened all at once. She used to laugh here. Her father did too. Long before the stillness set in. Long before she turned the lock from the inside and taught herself how to live without echoes. "Miss Clara!" Sadie called out suddenly, holding up a book with a faded blue cover. "This one smells like cinnamon." Clara blinked, then managed a thin smile. "That's because someone spilled cider on it, years ago." Sadie giggled again, delighted. From the back, Jack called, "Door's fixed." But Clara barely heard him, because the silence she'd grown so used to wasn't so silent anymore. Jack took a step back to admire his handiwork. Well, admire was generous. The door now swung open without a squeak or groan, which in his book counted as a small miracle. He wiped his hands on a rag, then glanced around the shop with fresh eyes. It was beautiful in its own way, charming, nostalgic, but also crumbling at the edges. The floorboards near the window sagged ever so slightly. A few shelves leaned like they'd had too much to drink. And the overhead light above the counter flickered with a stubborn hum every few seconds. He made his way back up front, where Sadie was perched on a low stool, reading aloud to no one in particular, and Clara was once again behind the counter, arms crossed, but watching everything. "You ever think about fixing the front step?" Jack asked, leaning against the counter. Clara gave him a long look. "What's wrong with the step?" "It dips," he said, "just enough to catch a boot if you're not paying attention. Could use a brace underneath." She raised an eyebrow. "That's awfully observant for someone who just came in to fix a hinge." "I fix things. I notice things." He nodded toward a shelf in the corner. "That one's bowing in the middle, and the light above you's buzzing like it's trying to talk." Clara almost smiled, but not quite. "Are you offering to give my entire shop a checkup?" Jack shrugged. "I've got afternoons off. I wouldn't mind." She stared at him, eyes sharp. "You don't even know me." "True," he said, "but my daughter seems to like you, and your bookstore, which is more than I can say for most places we've been lately." That caught her off guard. She didn't say anything for a few beats, just looked at him like she was trying to see what angle he was playing. But he wasn't selling anything. And that unsettled her more than a pitch ever would. "Fine," she said at last. "But I don't do small talk, and I don't like interruptions." "Understood," he said, tapping the counter once. "I'm good with quiet." And oddly enough, Clara believed him. By the next afternoon, Jack returned with a toolbox in hand and a quiet determination in his step. Sadie trailed behind, arms full of paper and crayons, promising to stay super quiet so she could draw while he worked. Clara met them at the door, already looking like she regretted saying yes. She held it open just wide enough to let them in, then quickly shut it behind them like she was keeping the rest of the world out. "Before you start," she said, voice brisk, "a few rules." Jack raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening slightly on the handle of the toolbox. "Okay." Clara stepped behind the counter, the space that always seemed to be her shield, her perch. 1. You don't go past the blue curtain in the back. That's storage and private. "Understood," Jack said easily, glancing at the faded curtain near the rear shelves. It fluttered faintly, like it was listening. 2, she continued, "no questions about the store's history or mine. You're here to fix, not to dig." Jack gave a small nod. "I don't pry." "And 3, she said, eyes narrowing slightly, "no talking about feelings. I don't do reminiscing, or sharing, or any of that messy stuff." "Wow," Jack said, chuckling softly. "You must be a riot at parties." Clara didn't laugh, but something flickered in her expression on acknowledgement, maybe even amusement, buried beneath layers of restraint. "I don't go to parties." Sadie settled into the reading nook with her coloring supplies, already humming softly as she began to sketch. Jack leaned his toolbox on the wall near the sagging shelf he'd offered to stabilize. "Just the work," he said, meeting Clara's eyes. "No questions, no snooping, no drama." She nodded, arms still folded tightly. "Exactly." But as she watched him crouch down and pull out a level, the air already filling with the scent of dust and fresh wood glue, Clara realized something strange. She wasn't relieved he agreed to her rules. She was disappointed he followed them so easily, and that unsettled her more than anything else. The attic wasn't really an attic, not the creaky, cobwebbed kind in stories, but more of a narrow upper loft tucked above the shop, accessible by a steep set of stairs near the poetry section. Clara hadn't touched it in years. It was where things went to be forgotten. Boxes of unsold books, mismatched furniture, her father's old desk, and other things she preferred not to think about. Sadie found it by accident. While Jack hammered a brace into one of the bottom shelves, and Clara pretended to focus on inventory logs she'd already reviewed twice, Sadie had wandered upstairs, trailing her drawings behind her like breadcrumbs. "Is this part of the store, too?" she called from above. Clara's head shot up. "Sadie, wait, that's not too late." By the time Clara reached the bottom of the stairs, Sadie was already crouched near the corner of the loft, where an old toy piano sat nestled beneath a dust-covered blanket. The kind with tiny chipped keys and peeling paint that had once been bright red. Clara froze halfway up the steps. Her chest tightened, breath shallow. She remembered that piano. Remembered the way her father used to sit her in front of it when she was no taller than Sadie. "Try the notes," he'd whisper, tapping the wooden keys with fingers too large, too gentle. "Play it like you're telling a secret." Sadie looked up at her, eyes wide. "Can I try it? It's so cute." Clara opened her mouth, ready to say no, but the word didn't come. Instead, she nodded barely. "Just gently." Sadie lit up. She pressed the keys one by one, slow and careful. The sound was soft and tinny, like music underwater. And then, somehow, the little tune began to form a pattern of notes, imperfect but familiar. Clara gripped the railing. That melody. Her father used to hum it while shelving books. A lullaby made of only 5 notes. She hadn't heard it in years. Sadie didn't know she was playing it. She just smiled, caught in her own rhythm. And Clara, for a moment, stood completely still, haunted and grateful. The sun had dipped below the rooftops by the time Jack finished bracing the last shelf. The store had grown quiet again, that late evening hush settling over it like a blanket. Clara had turned off the overhead lights and left only the desk lamp glowing, casting warm amber over her ledgers and a growing stack of receipts. Sadie had fallen asleep in the reading nook, her fairy tale book open across her chest, one arm draped over a crayon drawing of a red piano and a girl with silver wings. Jack washed his hands at the tiny sink in the back, shaking the dust from his shirt and rubbing the sore spot in his shoulder. When he stepped into the cramped break room behind the counter, Clara was already there, sitting stiffly at the small table with a steaming bowl of soup in front of her. There was another bowl and a spoon. Waiting. "I made extra," she said flatly, not looking up. Jack hesitated in the doorway. "I didn't know you cooked." "I don't. It's from a can." He nodded, stepping in slowly. "Still smells good." "It smells like salt and obligation," she muttered, sliding the second bowl toward him. He sat down across from her, unsure if this was a peace offering or a social experiment. Probably both. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile, more like a space. Neither of them quite knew how to fill. They ate quietly for a few minutes. The only sounds, the occasional clink of a spoon against porcelain and the soft tick of the ancient wall clock above the sink. "Sadie's a good kid," Clara said finally, eyes still on her soup. "Thanks," Jack replied, surprised she'd spoken first. "She's the best part of me." Clara nodded, chewing slowly. "She reminds me of someone." "Your daughter?" he asked, gently. She shook her head once, sharply. "No, I don't have kids." Jack waited for more, but it didn't come. Still, something in her voice, in the way she held her spoon like it was anchoring her, said everything she wouldn't. A flicker of memory. A wound not yet scabbed over. They ate in silence again. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was something in between. And somehow, that was enough. The storm rolled in fast thunder, cracking low across the sky as the last customer hurried out, clutching a damp umbrella and muttering about power outages. Jack leaned against the door just as the wind slammed it shut behind them, rattling the glass in its frame. Outside, rain slashed sideways, blurring the town into a smear of gray and silver. Clara stood behind the counter, arms folded, watching the sky with the wary look of someone used to storms that came without warning. Sadie was already curled up in the reading nook with a blanket and her book, the steady drumming of rain lulling her into the first stages of sleep. The store was dim, lit only by a few battery-powered lanterns Jack had found in the back storage earlier that week. They cast a golden, flickering glow that made the space feel smaller, closer, trapped, but not uncomfortable. "Roads'll be a mess," Jack said, watching the water pool at the edge of the sidewalk. "You can stay until it lets up," Clara replied, her voice softer than usual. "The roof leaks in aisle 4, but the coffee's still warm." He smiled, and for once, she didn't look away. They settled in at the small table near the front, each with a mug between their hands. The silence stretched between them, but tonight it didn't feel heavy. It felt like an invitation. Jack glanced at her. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Clara sipped her coffee, then stared down into it. "I did. Once. A long time ago." "What stopped you?" She let out a faint breath. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sigh. "My father died. The store was his. Everything he loved, everything he built it, was in these walls. I thought if I stayed, I'd still have some piece of him." Jack nodded slowly. "And now?" She looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, she didn't guard herself. "Now, I'm not sure if I stayed out of love or guilt. Or maybe because I didn't know who I was without this place." Outside, lightning flared, casting a sharp white flash through the windows. but inside it was warm, quiet, honest. The first layer had cracked, just enough to let the light in. The storm had passed by morning, but the quiet lingered thick, gentle, like the bookstore itself was holding its breath. Rain still tapped at the windows, now just a soft drizzle, and the sky outside was pale with early light. Clara stood near the front window, arms wrapped loosely around herself, watching as droplets slid down the glass in slow, lazy trails. Jack sat nearby, Sadie still asleep in the reading nook, her small frame bundled beneath a blanket, the fairy tale book open beside her like a sleeping friend. She was 3 when it happened, Clara said quietly, her voice sudden but not sharp. Jack looked up. "My dad," she clarified, still staring out the window. "He died on a Tuesday. Heart attack." Just like that. She tapped her fingers gently on the windowsill, not in rhythm, just enough to keep her hands busy. "I was 22. In college, I got the call during a seminar on 19th century poetry." Her mouth twisted into something like a smile. "I haven't opened a single poetry book since." Jack said nothing. He didn't need to. "I came home to handle the estate. Thought I'd clean it up, sell the place, move on. But I couldn't walk into this store without hearing him. He used to hum when he shelved books. Off-key, always. He made up stories for customers, told them the books whispered if you listened long enough." Jack smiled faintly. "Sounds like a good man." "He was," Clara said. "Too good. Too soft for the world. He poured everything he had into this shop and then left it all to me. No warning, no instructions, just silence." Her fingers curled around the edge of the sill. "I didn't want it at first. I didn't want any of it. But I couldn't bring myself to let it go. And the longer I stayed, the harder it got to imagine life outside of these walls." Jack stood slowly, walking over to stand beside her. "Maybe that's not a prison," he said quietly. "Maybe that's just love." Lingering. Clara didn't answer. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite so alone in her silence. Sadie had taken to exploring the shop like it was her own personal kingdom, wandering between shelves with a crayon behind one ear and a notepad in her hand, sketching things that only made sense to her. Clara let her. She told herself it was because the girl stayed out of trouble, kept quiet, didn't rearrange the alphabetized sections, but deep down, she liked hearing the soft hum of Sadie's voice as she made up little stories between the stacks. It was late afternoon when Sadie disappeared behind the counter again. Clara had warned her not to play back there, but she didn't have the heart to scold. Jack was off for the day, running errands and doing something with car parts he'd muttered about before leaving. The store was quiet, still. Clara was reshelving returns when she heard Sadie call out, "Hey, Miss Clara, what's Bellamy Press?" Clara's heart stopped mid-beat. She turned, slowly, toward the back. Sadie was sitting cross-legged on the floor, flipping through an old manila folder that must have fallen out from the lower cabinetone Clara hadn't touched in years. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping, edges curled and ink faded with time. Sadie held it up, squinting at the bold headline. "Bellamy Press founder passes suddenly. Daughter expected to inherit legacy." Clara's breath caught. She crossed the room in a few steps, plucking the paper gently from Sadie's hands. "Where did you?" she started, then stopped. Of course she knew. It had been in that folder since the week of the funeral. Sadie tilted her head. "Is that you? It says you were going to be the CEO." Clara stared at the article. Her own face looked back at her much younger, eyes hollowed by shock. There was a photo of her father beside it, smiling like he always did when he was in front of a camera, shoulders squared, proud. She traced the edge of the page with her thumb. "I was supposed to take over the company," she said softly. "Publishing contracts, national distribution, author tours. My father built something, bigger than this little store. Then why didn't you?" Clara looked down at Sadie, who wasn't asking with judgment, just curiosity, the kind that cut deeper. "I didn't want the spotlight," Clara said, folding the clipping gently. "I just wanted something I could hold on to that didn't feel like the world watching me fall apart." Sadie nodded, like that made perfect sense. And maybe, to her, it did. The next morning was all golden sunlight and dust motes drifting lazily through the air, the kind of morning that made everything feel lighter until it didn't. Jack showed up just after opening, toolbox in one hand and 2 coffees in the other. Clara didn't ask how he knew her usual order. She didn't ask, because asking would mean admitting she noticed, and that was more than she was willing to give. He handed her a cup without a word and got to work tightening the hinges on one of the back shelves. Sadie wasn't with him to day school, he'd said. Clara found the quiet, oddly, louder without her. It was just the two of them, surrounded by worn wood and words that had outlived most conversations. As Jack packed up, he leaned casually against the end of the counter, sipping his coffee. "So," he said, tone easy, "has this place always been yours?" Clara didn't look up. She felt it, though that question brushing against old walls. She could have dodged it, laughed it off, changed the subject. Instead, she lied. "Yeah," she said, "inherited it after college, been running it ever since." The lie was smooth, practiced. She'd told it before enough that it barely registered as false anymore. But something about the way Jack looked at her made it catch in her throat a little. He didn't press, just nodded, slow and thoughtful. "Makes sense. Feels like it belongs to you." Clara forced a smile. "I guess it does." But it didn't. Not really. It belonged to a life she hadn't chosen, to a legacy she'd walked away from, to a version of herself she'd buried beneath quiet routines and the weight of a family name she refused to carry. Jack gathered his tools and offered her a small wave before heading out. The door closed behind him with its usual soft chime. Clara stood there long after he left, coffee cooling in her hand, the lie still hanging in the air between the shelves like the scent of old paper familiar, comforting and impossible to fully scrub clean. It wasn't intentional. Jack had come by to fix the warped molding near the front window, a quick, easy job. He set his toolbox down behind the counter while Clara stepped out to the back room, her voice trailing off with something about needing to check an order slip. The paperwork was scattered across the desk. Nothing interesting. A few bills, a half-scribbled inventory list, a tattered copy of a distributor's invoice. And then he saw it. Just a corner of a letter, sticking out beneath a pile of catalogs. The heading read, "Bellamy Literary Holdings," and below that neatly typed and unmistakably official was the name, Clara Ellington Bellamy. His eyes lingered on it for a beat too long. Not because he meant to snoop, but because it clicked into place like a puzzle piece he didn't know he'd been missing. Clara Bellamy. The name itched at something familiar. He hadn't connected it before. But now, it buzzed at the edges of memory. Publishing. His mom used to talk about Bellamy Press Show. It was the crown jewel of American literature, once upon a time. It was in the back of old hardcovers, and the front of every book fair banner when he was a kid. Jack slipped his phone from his pocket. Just a glance, he told himself. Just curiosity. A quick search was all it took. Clara Ellington Bellamy, heiress to the Bellamy publishing fortune, vanished from public life at 22 after the sudden death of her father. Refused company leadership. Hasn't been seen since. He stared at the screen, then back at the bookstore. The creaky floorboards, the sagging shelves, the toy piano in the attic. It all looked different now, not less real. Just layered. Heavy in a new way. When Clara came back moments later, brushing dust from her hands, Jack had already tucked his phone away and resumed work. She offered him a faint smile. "That molding's been warped for years," Jack nodded, the secret now sitting quietly between them. "I can fix it." But the truth, that was going to be harder. It was just after closing when Jack finally said it. The door was locked, the lights dimmed. Sadie had gone home with a neighbor after school, and the bookstore was quiet in the way it always was, after hours like it exhaled once the world stopped looking. Clara was stacking returns near the counter, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, a faint smudge of ink on her wrist. Jack stood a few feet away, leaning against the poetry shelf, not touching the book he pretended to read. He watched her work in silence, jaw tight. "Clara?" he said quietly. "What are you running from?" She stilled, didn't turn, didn't speak, just held a book a little too tightly in her hand. "I didn't mean to find out," Jack continued. "I saw the name, Bellamy. Looked it up. Wasn't trying to dig, just... I wanted to understand." She placed the book down slowly, precisely, like every movement was keeping something inside from spilling over. "I told you not to ask questions," she said, her voice flat. "Not angry, not surprised, just tired." "I know," he said, "and I was trying to respect that. But you lied to me, to Sadie. You said this place was always yours." "It is mine," she snapped, turning now, eyes sharp. "Every wall, every story, every inch of dust, I've bled for it. I gave up everything else for it." Jack didn't flinch. "But you didn't build it." Clara looked at him like he'd slapped her, and maybe, in a way, he had. "I didn't want that life," she said, quieter now. "The meetings, the press, the expectations. I didn't want to smile for cameras and pretend I knew what to say after my father died." "I'm not judging you," Jack said, stepping closer. "I'm just trying to see the whole picture. Because I care. About this place. About you." She looked away, and when she spoke again, her voice was low. "Final. I think you should stop coming here." Jack froze. "Clara, I mean it." He stood there, heart thudding, 100 things unsaid between them. But she'd already turned her back, shoulders rigid, arms crossed against herself like armor. The bookstore had never felt smaller, or colder. And Jack left without another word. The next day, Clara opened the store to silence. The kind that didn't feel peaceful. The kind that echoed. The bell above the door jangled out of habit as she stepped inside, arms full of keys and morning chill. She moved through the motions, lights on, blinds half drawn, cash drawer counted, but everything felt off. The kind of off you can't quite name, only feel in your bones. She didn't expect them to come back. Not after what she said. She didn't want them to come back. That's what she told herself. Until she found the letter. It was sitting on the counter, tucked beneath the edge of a worn copy of Peter Pan. Just a folded piece of lined notebook paper, slightly crumpled, with her name written in careful, uneven print. Miss Clara Shee stared at it for a moment before picking it up. The paper was warm from the morning sun filtering through the windows. Familiar, soft. Inside, in purple marker and crooked hearts, was a single sentence: "Thank you for being my friend." Sadie, no flourishes, no questions, just quiet, innocent truth. Clara sat down behind the counter, the note resting in her open palm. She stared at it, something fluttering in her chest she hadn't felt in years, maybe longer. Sadie hadn't known about the lie. About the name, the legacy, the weight Clara dragged behind her like a shadow. Sadie didn't care. She only knew the woman who let her explore the aisles, who let her play a forgotten piano, who listened when she talked about the girl with silver wings and wolves in the forest. To Sadie, she wasn't the Bellamy heiress, she was just Clara. And that, somehow, cracked the armor more than any confrontation ever could. Clara reached for the folded letter again, smoothing it flat with gentle hands. Then she set it in the drawer beside the register, next to the old key to the attic and the photo of her father she hadn't looked at in months. She sat there for a long time, eyes closed, letting the quiet wrap around her like a fragile kind of grace. Maybe not everyone left. Maybe some people stayed, even if only on paper. It was a slow Thursday morning, the kind where the clock seemed too loud and the dust hung heavy in the light. Clara had just finished restocking the front display old poetry anthologies and forgotten novellas when the bell above the door chimed with a dull clang. She glanced up, expecting a local, maybe a tourist passing through. Instead, a man in a charcoal suit stepped inside. His coat was still damp from the misty air outside, and his leather shoes made no sound against the wood floor. He looked out of place in the bookstore, like someone who belonged in boardrooms and glass tower snot among cracked spines and handwritten signs. Clara stiffened. "Miss Bellamy?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Her mouth pressed into a hard line. "I go by Clara now." He nodded, polite but impersonal. "I'm Arthur Crane. I worked with your father's estate. I was his legal advisor for over 20 years. She didn't invite him in, didn't offer him tea or a chair. But he stepped forward anyway, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a folder thick with papers and official seals. "We've been trying to reach you for a while," he said, placing the file gently on the counter. "There's been some movement. The board has reorganized. The publishing division has a vacancy. They want you to consider returning." Clara blinked, once. "You mean they want me to take over the company I walked away from?" Arthur gave a small smile. "They're calling it a legacy revival. The Bellamy name still carries weight. And sentiment." She looked down at the folder, at the seal, at the life she'd once been expected to inherit like a crown she never wanted. "I told them no, years ago." "Things have changed," he said softly. "And if you don't step in, they'll sell it. The last of it." Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't set foot in a Bellamy office in over a decade. But the idea of strangers gutting what her father built, turning it into just another name on the spine of a mass-market deal felt like something else entirely. Arthur stood straighter. "Just read it. You don't have to decide now." Clara didn't answer. She only stared at the folder, heart pounding, as the past waited patiently in a manila envelope with her name on it. The folder sat untouched on the counter for 3 days. Clara walked past it a dozen times, each time meaning to throw it away or at least shove it into a drawer where she wouldn't have to see the gold-embossed seal staring at her like a challenge. But somehow, it stayed, right there, always in the corner of her eye, like it was daring her to open it, to admit that the past wasn't done with her. She hated how heavy it felt, how it made her fingers itch and her chest tighten. But mostly, she hated how it whispered to her late at night when the lights were off and the store had gone still. She'd built a life here, quiet, simple, safe, a rhythm of spines and shelves and dust that no one interrupted. The bookstore had been her hiding place and her altar, the last piece of her father she hadn't let the world take. But it was also the cage she'd locked herself in, and lately she wasn't sure which it was more of. On the 4th night, she took the folder home. She didn't read it all at once, just in pieces. Paragraphs at a time, terms, contracts, offers with too many zeros. And then the letter handwritten, folded carefully in the back pocket of the file. Her father's writing. Dated 3 days before his death. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And I'm sorry. I never gave you a chance to run your own way. I only ever handed you mine. But this company, this store, the words, the stories, they were always meant to be yours. However you choose to carry them. Or not." She folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, staring into the quiet of her apartment as tears stung the corners of her eyes. She didn't know what to do. If she went back, she'd be stepping into the world she'd fled from. If she stayed, she might lose what little was left of her father's dream. And for the first time in years, Clara Bellamy, who never wavered, never asked, never hesitated, didn't know which version of herself she was supposed to fight for. The town square was already glowing by the time Clara stepped onto the sidewalk, pulled tight into her coat, breath curling like smoke in the crisp winter air. Strings of warm lights hung from lamppost to lamppost, bobbing gently in the wind. Children darted between booths with red cheeks and sticky mittens, the scent of cider and cinnamon drifting through the air like a promise she hadn't meant to come. She'd planned to stay in the shop, as she always did during events like this, windows dark, door locked, a mug of tea growing cold beside the register. But Sadie had shown up that morning, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, and had looked up at Clara with that impossibly disarming conviction. "You have to come," she'd said. "There's music and cookies and a snowflake contest. I'm going to win with my Nate's got glitter and 3 folds." Clara had tried to say no. She really had. But then Sadie had added, almost as an afterthought. It won't be the same if you're not there. So now, here she was, standing at the edge of the square like a stranger in her own town. Jack spotted her first. He was manning a booth selling second-hand books for the school fundraiser, his sleeves rolled up and his laugh rising above the crowd like a beacon. When his eyes met hers, he smiled, but he didn't wave. Didn't draw attention. He just nodded, like he'd known all along she'd come. Clara wandered slowly, half expecting someone to recognize her not as Clara the bookseller, but Clara Bellamy, heiress. Vanishing act, but no one did. Or if they did, they let her be. At the center of the square, Sadie stood beside her glitter-covered snowflake, proudly pointing it out to anyone who passed. When she spotted Clara, her face lit up. "You came!" Clara nodded, unsure what to do with the sudden warmth blooming in her chest. Sadie grabbed her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Come see the snow maze. It's not scary, just fun." Clara let herself be pulled into the crowd, and for the first time in a long, long time, she let the world see. Heron didn't feel the need to run. The festival was starting to wind down, though the town square still shimmered with lights and laughter. Snow had begun to fall soft and lazy, the kind that didn't rush to the ground but drifted, like it had nowhere else to be. Music played faintly from a speaker near the cider booth, an old melody with a slow piano and the gentle hush of strings. Couples lingered under the lights, some dancing, some just swaying in the cold. Clara stood near the edge of the square, hands buried in the pockets of her coat, watching Sadie chase snowflakes with wild delight. Jack came up beside her, dusted with snow, his collar turned up against the chill. "She hasn't stopped smiling all night," he said, nodding toward his daughter. "That's on you." Clara shook her head, barely hiding a smile. "I just showed up. Sometimes, that's the hardest part." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the snow settle gently onto the old brick path between them. The music shifted to something slower, more intimate, like a secret being whispered in the cold. Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Dance with me." Clara blinked. "What?" "Here, now, just for a minute." People milled about around them, laughing, talking, moving. But somehow the world felt distant, faded, like they were in a snow globe, sealed in a softer kind of silence. She hesitated, then nodded. Jack stepped closer, offering his hand. She took it, unsure, tentative. His palm was warm, steady. He placed his other hand lightly on her waist, respectful and careful, like he knew exactly how fragile the moment was. They didn't say anything as they moved, slow and unpracticed. There was no rhythm, no lead, just presence. Clara's eyes lifted to the falling snow. It caught in her hair, in the folds of her coat. And when she looked at Jack again, something in her chest cracked open quietly. Irreversibly. She didn't pull away. Not from the cold, not from the closeness, not even from the feeling that she was letting herself be seen, not as a Bellamy or a bookseller or a woman hiding in plain sight. Just herself. And Jack, holding her like she mattered, saw all of it. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. The kind of morning where the shop breathed slow, and Clara had just started restocking the nonfiction section, her coffee still warm on the counter. Jack was upstairs, fixing a leak near the skylight, humming softly to himself. Sadie was sitting cross-legged behind the register, cutting snowflakes out of receipt paper and naming each one like a character in a story. The shelf had been wobbling for weeks, an old corner unit tucked near the back, where the biographies leaned more out of loyalty than structure. Clara had meant to reinforce it, but like so many things, it had been pushed to tomorrow. Then it gave. With a sharp crack, the wood split down one side and the entire middle section slumped forward, spilling books like a waterfall of forgotten lives. The thud made Sadie jump. Jack was down the stairs in seconds, scanning for damage. "You okay?" he asked, reaching to steady the shelf. "I'm fine," Clara said, crouching to pick up a scattered copy of Walden. It just gave up, I guess. But beneath the books, half buried in dust and time, something else had fallen out. A wooden box, faded, simple, the lid carved with a small engraving CB her father's initials, or hers, depending on how you looked at it. She stared at it for a long second, breath caught in her throat. Jack noticed. "What's that?" Clara didn't answer. She knelt slowly and brushed the dust off the lid, her fingers shaking just enough to betray her calm. The clasp was rusted, but gave with a soft click. Inside, bundled in twine and paper, were letters, dozens of them. Some still sealed, some yellowing at the edges. All in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Clara sat back on her heels, stunned. "I never knew these were here." Jack crouched beside her, his voice gentle. "What are they?" "Letters," she whispered. "From him. To me. After he died." She picked one up, hands trembling. She hadn't known how much she needed his words, until now, when they were all she had left. Clara sat on the floor of the back room, long after the store had closed, the wooden box resting in her lap like something sacred. The air was still, the lights low. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, a soft curtain of white settling over the windows. The world felt hushed, like it knew she needed the quiet. She opened the first letter slowly. "My Clara, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I'm sorry. I always meant to tell you more. Meant to leave more than just keys and unfinished inventory lists. But I was never good at talking when it mattered most. I've always trusted ink more than my own voice." Clara blinked hard, her throat tightening. His handwriting looped, slanted, familiar, felt like a voice reaching through time. "I worry about what this place might become for you. I built it with joy, but you carry things too quietly. I've seen it in your eyes since you were small. Always thinking, always protecting. And I worry you'll protect yourself right into a life where no one gets in." Her hand trembled as she turned the page. "You don't owe anyone the legacy I left. You don't need to be a publisher or a CEO or the face of anything, but promise me you won't disappear. Promise me you'll let someone in. A real life isn't made of paper and spines. It's made of people. Messy, honest, infuriating people." Clara swallowed, her chest heavy. Her father had known her too well, had seen her long retreat even before it happened. "You're not meant to be alone, Clara. I didn't raise you for silence. I raised you for story. And stories only live when they're shared." She folded the letter carefully and reached for another, and another. Each one was different memories of her childhood, reflections from his last days, little fragments of love and fear and longing. By the time she finished the fifth letter, her face was wet with tears she hadn't realized were falling. She wasn't angry. She wasn't broken. She was just cracked open. And for the first time in years, she let herself feel what had always been waiting on the other side of grief: connection. They sat on the old bench behind the bookstore, where the alley curled around to meet the back gardena, a small patch of quiet between brick walls and bare trees. Snow clung to the branches like lace. Clara had invited him without thinking, 2 mugs of tea in hand, the smell of cinnamon and clove curling into the air like comfort. Jack took the cup with a grateful nod, his gloved fingers warming around the ceramic. For a while, they just sat. No fixing shelves. No distractions. Then Clara said softly, "You never talk about her, Sadie's mom." Jack's jaw tensed, but not in the way she expected, not guarded. Just bracing. He looked out at the snow for a long time before answering. "Her name was Lauren," he said finally. "We met at a garage. She'd come in because her car wouldn't start, and I told her she needed a new battery. She told me I needed a better attitude." He smiled faintly. She was right. Clara watched him closely, the way his fingers tapped the side of the mug, the way his voice dropped just slightly when he said her name. She wasn't loud, but she lit up a room. Not because she wanted attention, just because she paid attention. To everything. People, books, wind, birds. She saw the small things. He paused. We were married 6 years. She got sick right after Sadie turned 3. By the time we got answers, it was too late for treatment to mean much. His voice caught. She wrote letters, too, for Sadie. I haven't let her read them yet. Clara felt something inside her ache, deep and quiet. Why not? Because once she reads them, they'll be gone. Just words on paper instead of something I can still feel in the air. He looked at Clara then, eyes steady. But that's not fair to Sadie. I know that. I've been trying to build something for her, out of what's left. A life. A place to grow. I keep thinking if I just try hard enough, it'll be enough. Clara didn't speak, just reached over and placed her hand gently over his. It was the simplest thing, but in the cold air, between their silences and their scars, it felt like the most honest connection either of them had known in a long time. The suitcase sat open on the bed, half filled with sweaters Clara hadn't worn in years and folders she hadn't touched until last week. The Bellamy estate had offered a car, a townhouse in the city, a private transition team. Everything was already arranged clean, efficient, expected. It had been so easy to say yes, almost. The offer letter lay on the desk by the window, signed but not yet sent. The signature had felt like a surrender, not a choice, but she'd convinced herself it was time. That holding on to the past in this bookstore, in this town, was just a quieter kind of running. She moved through the apartment like someone packing up someone else's life, every item folded with care, but without thought. The toy piano upstairs. Her father's letters, those she tucked into her satchel, sealed tight with ribbon. Maybe she'd reread them someday. Maybe she wouldn't. Outside, the snow had turned the town to hush. Streetlights blinked through a curtain of white, and in the distance she could hear laughter from the school's playground children bundled in scarves and joy, untouched by deadlines and expectations. She zipped the suitcase slowly, her fingers pausing at the handle. One last breath. One final look, and then the soft jingle of the bell downstairs. Her heart skipped. She hadn't unlocked the shop today. Hadn't planned to. She descended the stairs warily, suitcase forgotten at the top. Sadie stood just inside the door, cheeks pink, hair tangled from the wind, cradling something in her mittened hands. I made this for you, she said, holding out a folded piece of paper, thick with glue and glitter and uneven lines. Clara unfolded it with trembling fingers. A drawing, a storefront, a girl with brown hair standing behind the counter, and another girl smaller, grinning, holding a book with stars on the cover. At the top, in purple crayon, it read, "Don't go. The stories need you." Clara knelt slowly. Her throat burned. You knew I was leaving? She whispered. Sadie nodded. Daddy said you were thinking about it. I told him you just forgot where you belong. Clara pressed the drawing to her chest, and upstairs, the suitcase stayed right where it was and moved. The next morning, the bookstore felt different. The light through the windows was the same soft gold it always was, and the smell of paper and dust still hung in the air. But something had shifted. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was full of possibility, like the walls themselves were waiting for what came next. Clara stood at the center of the shop, hands in her coat pockets, staring at the shelves not as relics, but as foundations. For once, she didn't see what was falling apart. She saw what could be built. She heard the door creak open behind her, and didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Jack stepped inside, dusted with snow, toolbox in hand but unsure of what he'd been called for. You said you needed help? I do, Clara said, turning toward him, but not with a shelf. He waited, curious. She took a breath. I'm staying. His eyebrows rose just slightly. You're sure? Clara nodded. I was ready to leave because I thought staying meant standing still. But maybe I've been standing still because I thought I had to do this alone. Jack stepped closer, cautious but hopeful. What are you thinking? Clara smiled, a real one this time, small but certain. A new chapter. Not just a store that sells books. A place people come to be. Read aloud nights, workshops, maybe even a little cafe in the corner if we can figure out the plumbing. Jack chuckled. You're going to turn this place into a miracle. She looked around at the crooked shelves, the worn floorboards, the old globe still tilted slightly the wrong way. No, she said. We are. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The air between them was full of plans not yet spoken and stories not yet written. Sadie'll be thrilled, Jack said. She already calls this place her library. Clara laughed softly. She was the one who reminded me what it could be. He offered his hand. Not in romance, not yet, but in partnership. She took it, and just like that, the story started again. The new sign went up on a crisp Saturday morning, hand-painted in deep navy and brushed with gold leaf along the edges. It read simply, "The Bellamy Bookshop, not a boast, not a brand, just a name reclaimed with quiet pride." Inside, the store was nearly unrecognizable. The worn carpet had been pulled up to reveal the original hardwood, sanded and sealed until it gleamed. The shelves had been rebuilt still, charmingly mismatched, but now sturdy, inviting. A soft rug sprawled beneath a new children's corner, where beanbags sat beneath a canopy of string lights and shelves shaped like tree trunks. Crayons and coloring books waited in a woven basket beside a reading nook with tiny chairs. In the back, a modest coffee station offered fresh brews, cider, and cookies Sadie had helped decorate. The smell of cinnamon and roasted beans drifted through the shop like memory and comfort, and above it all, faint piano music played from an old speaker recorded from the very toy piano in the attic. Sadie had insisted. "It sounds like magic," she'd said. And she was right. By 10 o'clock, the first locals began to trickle in, then more. Families with toddlers, retired couples, teenagers who hadn't set foot in the store in years. They wandered slowly, wide-eyed, as if seeing something they hadn't realized they'd missed. Conversations began to fill the once hollow corners. Laughter echoed off the walls. The sound of pages turning blended with the clink of coffee mugs and the occasional shriek of a child discovering a book with dragons on the cover. Clara stood behind the counter, her hands clasped, unsure what to do with the fullness in her chest. She didn't recognize everyone, but they seemed to recognize her. Not the way they used to, with whispers and questions, but with warmth, with welcome. Jack moved through the shop with quiet confidence, fixing a crooked sign, clearing empty mugs, pausing now and then to catch Clara's eye. And, Sadie? She was seated in the children's corner, surrounded by 3 younger kids, holding her fairy tale book, like it was holy. Her voice was steady, animated. "Once upon a time," she read, "there was a girl who forgot how to fly," until she remembered that the sky had never stopped waiting. The bookstore had come back to life, and with it, so had Clara. The snow had returned in soft waves by the time the last customer left, their boots crunching down the steps as the bell above the door gave one last jingle for the night. Clara turned the sign to closed and took a long breath, one that filled her chest with warmth rather than weight. The store glowed behind her shelves full, mugs stacked by the coffee station, the faint scent of lavender and paper hanging in the air like something sacred. In the children's corner, Sadie had fallen asleep, curled up in a beanbag, the fairy tale book still open in her lap. Jack stood by the front window, hands in his coat pockets, watching the snow drift down in steady rhythm. Clara walked over, her steps quiet on the newly polished floor. "She okay?" he asked without turning. "She's perfect," Clara murmured. They stood in silence, watching the night settle around the town. A few street lamps flickered to life. Somewhere down the block, someone was shoveling a sidewalk, the scrape of metal rhythmic and familiar. Jack finally turned to her, and his face was different tonight. Not nervous, not unsure. Just certain. "You know," he said, voice low, "I spent so long trying to make a home out of broken pieces. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could build something solid for her. Something good. He looked down, then back at Clara. But it turns out, home wasn't a place. It was a person. Or maybe, two people. Clara swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. Jack stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper now. You and Sadie. You're home. She didn't cry, not quite. But her hand reached for his without hesitation. No ring. No fanfare. Just truth spoken in the quiet between two people who had lost and found in equal measure. I don't need a big answer, he added. Just don't ask me to leave. Clara looked up at him, her smile soft, steady, more certain than any yes she'd ever said in her life. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered. And neither are you. The morning of Sadie's 9th birthday dawned with soft snow on the windowsill and the scent of pancakes drifting through the little apartment above the bookstore. Jack was already in the kitchen, humming off-key as he flipped batter onto a hot griddle, while Clara wrapped a small package with shaking hands. No ribbons. No glitter. Just twine and a navy blue cover with gold-embossed stars. Sadie burst into the room wearing a paper crown she'd made out of a grocery bag, eyes wide and hair wild with sleep. Is it ready? Is it time? Can I open something now? Clara smiled and held out the package. Only if you're ready for something special. Sadie took it carefully, as if it might be fragile. She ran her fingers over the cover, then slowly opened the front page. Her name was written there, in careful script, in Clara's hand. To Sadie, who reminded me how stories live when you share them. Love always, Clara. Below it, the title. The girl who found the door. Sadie gasped, flipping pages, eyes flying across each one. Inside were hand-drawn illustrations and soft, lyrical prose about a quiet girl who wandered into a forgotten bookshop and discovered a door that only opened for people who believed in magic. Through the door, the girl found not treasure or dragons, but something rarer, a place to belong, a family made not by birth, but by love, a home built out of kindness and second chances. Did you write this? Sadie whispered, eyes wide. Clara nodded. Every word. Sadie threw her arms around her, books squished between them. It's my favorite already. Jack leaned in the doorway, watching with a quiet smile. Clara looked at him over Sadie's shoulder and felt that deep, anchoring warmth again, the kind that wasn't loud but certain. Like turning a page and knowing you want to keep reading. Sadie pulled back, clutching the book to her chest. Will you read it to me tonight? Clara knelt and kissed her forehead. Every night, if you want. And when Sadie skipped off to tell Jack all about her birthday plans, Clara stayed kneeling for a moment longer, the weight of love and story settling in her hands. This time, she wasn't holding on to the past. She was writing the future. The bookstore still stood on the corner of Willow and Hart, its bricks weathered, its windows full of books and soft light. The sign above the door, once faded and forgotten, now gleamed beneath a brass lantern. The Bellamy Bookshop. No longer just a place to browse, it had become a heart of the town. A quiet pulse in the rhythm of everyday life. Inside, the shelves had grown fuller. Worn paperbacks and glossy new releases stood side by side. A chalkboard near the front listed weekly events in bright cursive. Storytime at 4. Coco. Classics on Thursdays. Writing Club Saturdays. It was just past sunset on a winter evening, and the glow from the tall windows spilled out onto the snowy sidewalk like something out of a story. Clara sat in the center of the children's corner, a picture book open in her lap. Her voice floated through the room warm. Steadya's a dozen children leaned in, eyes wide, Coco forgotten in their hands. Jack sat beside her, legs crossed, occasionally giving voices to the silliest characters, sending ripples of giggles through the room. Near the back, Sadie, now a teenager with glasses and a long braid, stood on a step stool, shelving books with care. She wore a cardigan that had once been Clara's and carried herself with the ease of someone who'd grown up in the smell of paper and the sound of stories. Every now and then she looked over her shoulder and smiled. At her family, at her home, on the rug beside the reading circle. A little boy with curls, the color of chestnuts, leaned against Jack's leggy eyes, half closed, but his hand still clutching the edge of the storybook. Clara reached over, brushing the hair from his forehead, her voice softening at the chapter's end. And so, the girl who thought she was lost found something better than a map. She found people who saw her, and stayed. Outside, the snow had begun again. Slow, gentle. And in the window, the bookstore glowed warm, Constanta light that had once gone out but had found its way back, story by story, hand by hand.